We're going to start off with our first panel, which I'll be chairing, on international experiences and lessons. And there we have one paper which will be presented by Awande, Buthelezi and William Shoki. So I'm going to hand straight over to Awande.
Thanks, Jane. So I had problems with my computer, and I'm just going to be taking some notes from here that I've written down on my phone. There we go. Okay, so yesterday's conversation at the end, or presentations towards the end, and the larger conversation that we had towards the end of that session kind of preempted a lot of what I was going to focus on, or what I was going to speak about. But I think that's quite great, because then we get to expand the conversation, because there's a lot of energy in the room, in the conversation around that time. So it gives us a lot more space to get into greater depth with regards to that. But just to kind of rehash some of the things that we spoke about, and some of the things that I was going to say that we have already covered, is that, you know, we do find ourselves at the crossroads right now, where if you are in a position where you do think that a political party, organization form, or just more generally a political instrument is something that is required, or something that would be needed moving forward, or if you're in favor of it and see its value, not even if we necessarily have to build one, you're primarily left with two options in this country. And that is whether to look at the existing political party structure and see which one you can build alliances with, or give energy to and support. And then the other option is obviously the latter, or the one that we spoke about yesterday, is how constructing that 21st century political instrument or model. So if you do the former and look at the landscape, then if we're speaking realistically, you're looking at the tripartite alliance or the EFF as possible options to work with. But if you're looking at the latter, then the conversation becomes, I think, a bit more exciting, and it requires a lot more imagination, and the level of imagination that we need for the scale of what we're facing in this century. And I think that the case of Bolivia, for me, offers a very interesting example of how, you know, you could create or shape that kind of structure or instruments, and especially as they call it, the movement towards socialism, the Mas Party, as they define it themselves as a political instrument, not a political. And just to speak more generally about the structure of Mas, before going into a more broader, expanded conversation about the international context and why I think such instruments are required for building regional and international links, because I think that our struggle as you know, left-wing thinkers or socialists, someone articulated it yesterday, that it's also always been rooted in international solidarity. So we have to understand that our thoughts around creating a movement or political instrument are not just for the needs of the people of this country, but it's for the needs of, you know, the people of planet Earth. And the concept of the climate crisis kind of brings that into focus, because we have to find ways to work together on a global level. So when you look at the movement towards socialism, or the Mas, its roots or its origins are in the cocoa growers unions of the 1980s. And during that period, there were a number of mines that were shut down, and you saw a transfer of mine workers into the cocoa growing sector, which actually strengthened that union base. And throughout that period, you saw federations coming together and forming links with other social movements of indigenous peoples. And I think it's around 1992 where those links start to solidify, and through that period into 95, once those relationships are consolidated, they decide on creating this instrument, not a political party, but an instrument which would have one foot in movements and one foot in the political realm, representing the will of these different movements that were working together hand in hand. And it's only in 2005 that after that period of consolidation, working at the grassroots level, that it's in 2005 where you see Evo Morales coming into power as they first, the first like time that they capture national power. So there's a long period there. If you look at that contextually, when you speak about these things, I mean, there is a sense of, the urgency is now, so we need these things now. But then you look at the context of history of how things progress, there's that kind of, decades and years period when you look at it realistically. And I mean, they were successful enough in terms of, as that kind of political instrument, to bring poverty down in their country, minimize inequality, grow the economy to a degree where even the IMF and the World Bank said it was something short of a miracle, what they're able to do. And obviously there are a couple of issues with regards to their reliance on hydrocarbons and fossil fuels. And even people have made arguments around the way in which resources have been extracted for their process of industrialization. But I'm not really going to get into that. I'm just speaking about the merits of how their political form and organization and the way in which those movements were able to position themselves through the structure within the political realm was able to serve those interests. And I think nothing speaks to that more clearly than the events of the past year, where last year, the right wing were able to come together, and with the help of, I think it's the Organization of American States, the OAS, they were able to push and implement a right-wing coup. And I'd argue that if they weren't so organized and did not have this kind of structure that could bring everyone together in a way that they could have a strong political front, we wouldn't have been able to see the quick reversal of that coup in the way that we've seen now in this year. I mean, they've been together for years, but at least on a political basis, those alliances and that consolidation and those lines of solidarity and linkages were there to be able to resist and to be able to actually push back against these right-wing Christian fascists. So I think that's, for me, is also a really important thing we have to keep into consideration, especially when we're talking to the context of how in this country, on our continent, that kind of right-wing shift has a different face, it has a different look, it's got different characteristics, but it still requires the same level of political organization, the same levels of, grassroots consolidation. And I think that, Bolivia's case is very interesting to me because it shows what happens when people are organized to that degree. And I don't think that you can say that the movement's lost autonomy. And even though there has been problems with regards to, top down versus bottom up nature, but they still exist, and they still exist in tandem, or to exist strong enough to be able to provide the kind of political support that was required to make the shift that they've achieved in this year's elections. So I think that's something really important that we can learn from, especially as people of the Global South. I feel that a lot of our pessimism with regards to the political realm or political organization in that regard or in that form has been informed by a lot of things or examples of, obviously from our own context, African nationalism and African nationalist parties and their failures in the 20th century. But a lot of it also has to do with the failures of European or Western left-wing organizations. And I think that we have to take the good where we can find it, and we have to take inspiration from these examples in the Global South, such as Bolivia. And I use Bolivia as an example because I think it presents an interesting contrast to the Venezuelan model. You got two similar kind of trajectories of both proposing a move towards socialism, but the way in which they operate is different. So I think that we also sometimes can internalize our own kind of negative perceptions with regards to the space for democratic cooperation within these kind of organizations. I think just the difference between what you see in Bolivia and what you see in Venezuela shows that there's different ways in which those structures can be organized. And then I just want to end off by saying that, that movements in and of themselves are important, but they're not enough. And parties are important, but they're not enough. Hence why I'm trying to give an explicit focus or underlining the term that Michelle said yesterday of political instrument of the 21st century, because I think that's where we need to start thinking of, explicitly thinking in that way of how do you shape that? How do you think about that? How should it look? And to not be scared by the failures of the past, and to not be weighed down by the scale of the future crisis, but to be inspired by the possibilities of what can be done when we don't limit ourselves with regards to how we can think around these issues. But I also like to argue that it's not only something that we should just do because it's that it's necessary, it's fundamental to actually being able to achieve any of the shifts in power that we will require to be able to achieve the things that we need in this century, regionally, locally, and globally. And I think that, there's a case of an example made yesterday actually about the anti-Iraq war movement. And I think that's, for me, is a very interesting case about, when I think about some of the failures from the early 21st century, because I think you can learn from them without being discouraged by them, that was one of the biggest global kind of movements in the world, the anti-war movement. But when you study the way in which the political machinations of obviously not taking into account that the United States is the United States, so whatever they want to do will go, was that there's the political nature in which they manipulated processes to achieve what they did. And then once that happened, how quickly that movement kind of dissipated is kind of disheartening. But it's also encouraging the degree to which people from around the world were able to come together in the first place to take that kind of position. But it does also indicate that, there has to be something stronger that can keep people together just when losses occur, because losses will always happen, but you need to be able to move beyond the losses and stay consolidated so that you can fight another day. And I'd like to think that if something like the anti-war movement of that period was still alive after the war, we wouldn't have had Libya, we wouldn't have had Syria. A lot of other things would have been able to be avoided. So I think that there's no other option but to build, the political instrument for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks, Awande. Those were some very good reflections and helps pave the way for what my contribution is going to be, which is with respect to this question of what does a political instrument for the 21st century look like? And this contribution, I think, is largely based off a lot of the conversations that were had yesterday about how to create this organizational vehicle that, as Awande was establishing, has its foot in social movements, but nevertheless remains one that contests for political power and tries to build that political power. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, I think, a very unlikely sort of example of how we can learn about what this political instrument might look like. And it comes from north of Bolivia and South America, in fact, from the countries that are usually proving to be the thorns at their side, and it's the United States of America. And what I want to talk about is the Democratic Socialists of America, which is this organization which, especially in the last decade, has experienced a meteoric rise in its membership. It's proven more and more decisive for progressives in the United States of America to be affiliated with the DSA so that they can, when they're ascending to office, when they're contemplating implementing certain keystone policies such as the Green New Deal or Medicare for all. And of course, the DSA was very instrumental in Bernie Sanders' both 2016 and 2020 electoral bid. And what is interesting about the DSA is that it's not a political party, but nor is it a social movement. And the best way to describe what the DSA is it's a membership organization that is primarily socialists coming together to support socialist causes and socialist activities. And it was formed in 1989 as the outgrowth of the remnants of the Socialist Party of America. So the Socialist Party, which was started in 1901 and dissolved in 1973, was America's leading socialist organization. And it was famously at one period at its height led by the famous American labor leader, Eugene Debs. But it was unfortunately dissolved in 1973 after it decided to reconstitute and join the Social Democrats of the United States of America. And Michael Harrington, who was a member of the Socialist Party of America, led the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and that was a faction of the Socialist Party of America which decided wasn't happy with the Socialist Party becoming part of the Social Democratic movement. And so in 1989, when the DSA was formed, it meant to be this organizational body whose primary task was to advance the socialist cause, but not by directly contesting elections itself, and to serve as this vehicle through which it would support progressive candidates and through which it would rally behind these progressive candidates, contribute volunteers for their electoral campaigns, contribute the surrogates who would be champions for a lot of the policies that they'd want to run. And so in the 80s, for example, it played a significant role in trying to help Jesse Jackson get elected as president and as a Democratic nominee. But it never really sort of pierced sort of national consciousness and national attention until recently. And in 2016, the DSA burst into America's national scene through Bernie Sanders' electoral bid. And at the time, I think the DSA's membership growth went to, I think 50,000 at that point. And as of November 2020, the DSA has 85,000 members. So it's this massive organization. I mean, given that it's a socialist organization, and given that it's primarily it's operative in the United States of America, which is the one place where the Red Scare is still alive and well, it's impressive that it's managed to amass this membership. And not only that, but it's been extremely integral in recent years for the election of progressive candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. And I think as much as those candidates, because they're superstars at this stage, it's impressive to point their success in getting those candidates elected and giving them endorsements. I think the DSA really proved its importance to American politics in this most recent election season, when 26 out of the 29 candidates that it was fielding or that it had endorsed for elections were elected to power. And some of these include exciting progressives such as Jamal Bowman, Jabari Brisport, Zohran Mamdani, who's the son of Mahmoud Mamdani, and Mira Nair. And it's changed its focus, moving from getting these candidates elected to Congress to getting these candidates elected locally. So primarily trying to get candidates elected either to state senate or supporting the elections of people who are running for office, such as district attorney and so on. So I'm running out of time, but to make some quick sort of analytical points about the DSA, I think what's interesting about the DSA is that it manages to straddle this point of being an organization that is not itself directly contesting for power, but one in its activities nevertheless supports social movements. A criticism to make of the DSA is that a lot of its energies end up inevitably getting sucked into that electoral politics. And because the nature of America's political system is that elections are happening all the time, that a lot of its energies are directed towards getting these candidates elected. But it's made a concerted effort, especially after its most recent national convention, to advocate and champion causes that are directly connected to movements themselves. So trying to get more involved in supporting the labor movement in America and a whole array of social movements in America, which unfortunately still remain underdeveloped in the large part in the United States. Another criticism to make of the DSA is that because they're a membership-driven organization, so unlike a front, which is how we tend to do these things here in South Africa, where it would be different organizations through which you gain membership of the larger parent organization. The DSA is an individual membership-driven organization. So at the grassroots, a local chapter is established. Anyone can constitute a chapter. If the DSA was in South Africa, we could constitute a chapter here at WITS, and individuals join the organization themselves and participate in the organization in their individual capacity, not through an organization, which has led to the tendency of a large swath of the DSA's membership being vested in college campuses, in the professional managerial class, as some call them. So it's these usually socialist, high-earning professional members who are part of the DSA. I think more than 29% of the DSA's membership earns more than $100,000 a year, which is not reflective of the majority of Americans, and especially the constituency that the DSA advocates for. So it can end up being this organization which largely has its support and membership in the middle class. That could be different in a country with different dynamics, such as South Africa. And I had another point, which has now escaped me. But I think I'm out of time as well. 1 minute, okay. So yeah, one thing to say further about the DSA, and this is, I think, very interesting for a South African context, is that it's steadfastly committed to what it calls the political realism of America's politics, which is that the DSA hardly supports third-party candidates. The DSA believes that the only way to build power in America is through the Democratic Party, and they think that the reality of the two-party system in America is such that, unfortunately, there's no way of getting around it, and that the most you can hope for is supporting these progressives that are working in the Democratic Party and try to help build a viable left-wing tendency within the Democratic Party that can influence the party as a whole. And I think that's especially interesting when thinking about especially a lot of what Janet was saying yesterday about how in South Africa, it might be time for a similar conversation about how if we try to establish a new party, we might be developing unnecessary enemies, and it might just be the case that it's a more strategic move to try and support individuals within South Africa's pre-existing political fold and to try to help them rise to ascendancy, help them rise to influence, and help them rise to office. And this is a position that the DSA still remains by, even after the defeats and the dismay of Bernie Sanders' electoral bid being obstructed by the Democratic Party. And there's some hope that it's working, because they have a high success rate of electing their candidates than the Democratic Party as a whole. And there's a clearly established left-wing tendency in the Democratic Party that the mainstream is listening to. Joe Biden is listening to Cortez and Omar and Tlaib and Presley. And so that's an example of a political instrument for the 21st century. I think the jury's still out on whether or not the DSA model can be successful. It remains to be seen whether or not they can build power in any significant sense, whether or not they can successfully connect themselves to America's labor movement and its social movements. But as far as its electoral political activity goes, I think they have an impressive track record. So that's it from me.
Thank you.